Hello, and welcome to our second event in the Future of Journalism, the Fate of Democracy. Thank you for joining us. I'm Matthew Gibson, Director of Virginia Humanities, and I'm especially pleased we could present this event with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Federation of State Humanities Councils. We also appreciate our presenting partners at Black Millennials for Flint, Colorado Humanities, Humanities DC, Illinois Humanities, and the Society of Professional Journalists, Virginia Pro Chapter. Tonight's conversation is the second of two events. Both are part of Democracy and the Informed Citizen, a Mellon-funded national initiative focusing on the crucial need for local journalism. Tonight's roundtable will focus on the nonprofit organizations supporting or practicing accountable journalism, including practitioners, advocates, and funders who are innovating in the news and media literacy space. Just a couple of notes before we hand the program over to our speakers for today's event. First, please share your questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom, not the chat. Second, this event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time during the event by using the closed captions tab also at the bottom of your window. And last, if this sort of programming is important to you, we encourage you to visit virginiahumanities.org, where you can learn more about our work, and please consider making a donation to support ongoing work at virginiahumanities.org/give. And now I'm pleased to introduce our illustrious participants. Karen Rundlet is Director of the Journalism Program at the Knight Foundation. Her focus is on investing in new methods and models to advance excellence in journalism and civic media as a way to support informed local communities. Previously, Karen worked as a journalist at the Miami Herald, contributed business reports to various public radio newsrooms, and began her career as a television news producer in the Miami, Atlanta, and New York markets. Betsy Wells Edwards is the Executive Director of the Virginia Press Association. She has served in public information, development, and director roles for numerous organizations, including the Virginia Department of Transportation, the ACLU of Virginia, and the Virginia Fair Trial Project. Betsy holds a degree in political science and journalism from Indiana University. Courtney Hurt is the program manager for Newsmatch at the Institute for Nonprofit News, where she works closely with newsrooms and funders to advance the business model for nonprofit news. In addition to significant experience developing revenue strategies for journalism, in 2017, Courtney was named a German Marshall Fellow and traveled across Europe to explore the role of journalism as it plays in restoring democracy. Jacquanda Johnson is founder and publisher of Flint Beat, a Flint area native with more than 20 years of experience in journalism. She has worked for the Detroit News, NBC 25, Fox, and MLive media group, the Flint Journal. As a reporter covering Flint for MLive, Jacquanda determined that the community needed a news publication focused solely on Flint and launched Flint Beat in March 2017. Alan C. Miller is the founder and CEO of the News Literacy Project, a national nonpartisan education nonprofit established in 2008 to give educators the tools to teach their students how to separate fact from fiction in the digital age. The News Literacy Project is now the nation's leading provider of news literacy education. During Alan's journalism career, including 21 years at the Los Angeles Times, he received more than a dozen national reporting honors, including the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. Chris Tyree is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism, an independent nonprofit news organization serving the Commonwealth of Virginia. For more than 30 years, he has reported stories on nearly every continent and won numerous international awards. Chris's reporting on microplastics in global drinking water and bottled water for Orb Media led the World Health Organization to investigate the human health implications and spawn global research into the effects of microplastic pollution. And last but not least, Steve Waldman is the president and co-founder of Report for America, an initiative of the Ground Truth Project. He planned Report for America after writing the FCC landmark report, Information Needs of Communities, which NPR described as, quote, one of the most comprehensive overviews of the US media ever produced, end quote. An experienced entrepreneur, national editor, and best-selling author, Steve also served as senior advisor to the CEO of the Corporation for National Service. Thank you all for joining us today. And Karen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Welcome, everyone. Thank you to the audience for joining us today for part 2 of this conversation. I work at Knight Foundation. I'm a director in journalism, and we invest in local news. In 2019, Knight Foundation made an increased commitment to funding the future of local news over the next 5 years. There are others who have joined us in this commitment as well. We really saw local news as an opportunity. National news in many ways is quite sturdy. Local news has been declining for some time. Newspapers and digital startup organizations play a particularly unique role because they are the ones reporting the most original local reporting. And in many instances, local newsrooms have lost their staffs over the last 10 years. Our increased commitment, we made a commitment of $300 million during that time, and we've invested that in a number of organizations. Some of those organizations are on the panel today with their leaders. We have different kinds of folks on the panel tonight, and I want to start by giving everyone just a couple of minutes just to explain exactly what they do. And I'd like to start with, we have a journalist and we have a publisher. So I'd like to start with Chris Tyree from the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism. Chris, if you could just tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing now.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Karen. And I want to thank Matthew and everyone at Virginia Humanities who have been kind of instrumental. We've been talking with Matthew and the Humanities since our inception. And around 2017, we started work on the concept of VCIJ. I'm from Virginia. I actually live not very far from where I grew up. And I've worked in this state for quite a few years. My idol was always the Virginian Pilot newspaper. And that's where I met our co-founder, my colleague, Lou Hansen, who's our executive editor. And in 2017, I was working for a global nonprofit news organization, helping them get set up, Orb Media. And a lot of the things that we were doing there seemed like they could be a good model for what could possibly work in Virginia on a more macro level, especially around publishing collaborations. And so I was actually putting in an application for a Knight Fellowship that year. And this sort of model, and I was working with Lou and bringing this all together. It was a very different thing then, but over the year, about a year into it, and talking with so many great people from around the country, looking at different models, we settled on this focus of doing investigative journalism. It looked like, of all the disciplines in journalism, investigative reporting has been kind of the hardest hit. News teams at newspapers, and we still have some great journalism in Virginia, and people working really hard, but not to the caliber, not to the level, not to the capacity that we had back 20 years, 15 years ago. So we found like that could be our niche, and we can, doing that kind of work, we could support legacy and new media and really rethink sort of the journalism neural network in Virginia. And I will give a huge shout out right now to a couple panelists, Betsy Edward, who at Virginia Press Association was really, instrumental in helping us think through how we could connect with legacy media in Virginia. And Courtney Hurt, if it hadn't been for INN and Newsmatch, we wouldn't be where we're at today. And trust me, we're very small still. Just finished our case for support and have put sort of the finishing touches on our proof of concepts for moving forward. So, but yeah, thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. I want to turn to Jacquanda Johnson of a Flint Beat, also a journalist and a publisher, an entrepreneur, and congratulations on your Emmy. I understand that you just learned pretty recently that you got an Emmy, so congratulations. Tell us a little bit about how you got started with Flint Beat.
Flint Beat is a hyperlocal news site focused solely on the city of Flint, Michigan. In 2017, I just started talking to residents, the community. I'm a Flint girl, born and raised. And so I started talking to the community about what they wanted to see. And what I decided was to identify news gaps. At the time we had water crisis, sports, and crime. That was most of our news. Being from Flint, I knew there was much more to tell. I think when I left MLive, I had like 40 story ideas on a sheet of paper. So one day I just wrote my resignation on the back of an agenda during a meeting, and I just decided to leave. Entrepreneur or a business person, but as a journalist. And so I just started writing stories like I would when I was working for MLive, which didn't fare well. A few months later, I had to kind of shift gears and think about it as a business, but I worked it by myself up until last year. And so we celebrated 4 years, March 13th of this year. So up until April last year, I was the only person working this thing. And last year we started getting financial support. Borealis with the Racial Equity in Journalism Fund, the Facebook Journalism Project, Google News Initiative, Solutions Journalism Network, this year our local community foundation. We went from maybe writing one story to now we're daily. I have 3 full-time reporters. We're supported by Report for America. We have our second person in our newsroom, which is phenomenal because we're able to do some things that we couldn't do before. So we just started to feel a need. Covering City Hall is one of our big things. So we really focus on local government, solutions, journalism, public health, and now with the help from Report for America, we're expanding our coverage to economic development and covering the nonprofit sector. So that's what we do.
Excellent, thank you. So Jacquanda, though, you were mentioning that you've received support from Borealis Philanthropy, from Facebook, from Google News. Those are grants. Courtney Hurt is also on our panel, and she is from the Institute for Not-for-Profit News, and she runs a philanthropic program called Newsmatch. Courtney, what is Newsmatch and how does it support organizations like the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism and Flint Beat?
Right, both organizations are members of the Institute for Nonprofit News. I have emailed with you all probably a number of times over last year's Newsmatch campaign, and really Newsmatch, is here to really bring back and restore those independent news media outlets to be able to deliver news to their communities. And it does that by focusing on how they can become sustainable. So while, the decline of papers are certainly of great concern, what's happening though, our new outlets are really emerging to fill in the gaps within their communities, and they're doing it in very different ways. A lot of them, as members of our panelists, are previous journalists who are now stepping into the role of an executive director, who are now stepping into the role of a publisher or business leader in the quote unquote nonprofit sector. And there is a role to be done in helping news organizations build their fundraising capabilities and capacity through training, through shared services, through direct services. And what has been one of the most valuable components of Newsmatch is allowing there to be information exchange amongst the panelists themselves. But this learning component is really one of the 3 mechanisms that really drives the program. The first is a matching gift campaign, where a group of national funders have decided that, news is important and we need to get more people to support it. We need to get individuals to realize that it's important and give their support. So funders like the Knight Foundation, Democracy Fund Foundation, we even have family foundations and individuals who put their resources together to say, hey, look, when communities step up and give to support nonprofit news, we're going to match their support. And what it's done is just unlock this groundswell of support from individuals around the country. The third component is really all about building awareness, helping communities realize the role that nonprofit news plays in their community, to share information, to shed light on inequities, to hold people to account. And Newsmatch is sort of behind the scenes helping stabilize those sources. So since Newsmatch launched in 2016, at that time, Knight Foundation built the program and was the sole funder, matching gifts raised by 57 newsrooms. But since then, the program has expanded to be supported by more than 17 national funders, and we're also seeing local funders, both in the form of individuals, community foundations, and businesses. Nearly 300 of them have also joined to provide matching gifts for newsrooms. And the result is, unlocking more than $150 million from individuals. Newsmatch is really here to transform how communities view, sustain, and support journalism. And that's our call. That's really the solution that we're bringing to the table here.
Thanks, Courtney. So I'm trying to kind of draw a line from all our different panelists. I will say that right at the beginning of this, Chris was talking very much about Betsy's work. And Betsy also serves the Commonwealth, Virginia Press Association, and there are about 175 members. And she was telling me earlier that there are still 20 daily news organizations. Other members serve our weeklies. And Betsy, what would you say is the role of the Virginia Press Association in helping publishers to still inform Virginians?
Well, thank you, Karen, and thanks to all of you for having me on tonight. We're an organization that's been around since the 1880s. We were founded or established by the Virginia General Assembly. Most every state has a press association, and we serve sort of a dual purpose. We are both a trade association, but a 501c6, so we're a nonprofit, and we have a 501c3 foundation, so a charitable arm. We're here to support newspapers in every way. Virtually every newspaper in Virginia is a member. As you said, Karen, we have 20 dailies and about 85 weeklies in Virginia. So we're here to help them with lobbying, with training, with resources, with anything that a newspaper needs to be sustainable and do their job. Of course, the underlying reason we exist is to support a free press and its role in our democracy. So we have many partners that we work with. Chris is one of them. We work with local government, state government, other foundations, SPJ, any organization that we think will help newspapers in Virginia. So our role is to help them as both businesses and as organizations that provide community journalism. So that's VPA's role.
Excellent. I want to turn it over to Steve Waldman. Alan, I'm going to get to you, but I want to talk to Steve Waldman of Report for America. Steve works for an organization that places reporters in different news organizations, some of which are for-profit newspapers and some of which are nonprofit newsrooms, some of which are public radio stations, some of which are commercial television stations. Steve, if you could tell us a little bit about how your work serves some of the people that we've heard from tonight and the ecosystem across the country.
Thank you, Karen. Well, as you said, we describe ourselves as a national service program that places reporters into local newsrooms to report on undercovered topics and communities. That's the heart of the program. We essentially run two national competitions, one for reporters, one for newsrooms. The one for reporters is very, very selective. I think we picked about 5% of the applicants this last round. We now have 300 reporters in the field in 115 newsrooms, evenly split between for-profit and nonprofit. And they are selected, as you might imagine, on talent and excitement, and to some degree having drunk the Kool-Aid about the idea that local journalism is a public service. We're looking for people who are not only looking for jobs, but who really believe that in the cause of saving democracy and strengthening communities through local journalism. There's also competition among newsrooms. They compete to get these hotshot subsidized reporters. And in order to compete, they have to prove two things. One is that there's an important gap in coverage. That's actually not that hard to prove these days. And secondly, that they would deploy these reporters well. And that's extremely competitive as well. You have to really be among the top, which is why Flint Beat is one of the Report for America newsrooms. And then we provide the newsrooms with 5 or 6 reporter candidates that seem like good matches. And then the newsrooms decide. They hire the person who they think is going to be best for them. We then pay half the salary in the first year. And the newsroom's on the hook for the other half, but we work with the newsroom to help raise a portion of their half. So we're providing journalists, but we're also working to help them with sustainability, to help them develop, the muscles of local philanthropic giving. And all in all, about 45% of our core are journalists of color. So we're also serving an important role in helping newsrooms to better represent their communities. And the beats are all over the map. So it's very organic, bottom up. We let the newsrooms tell us what they think the most important issues are. So in doing that, we can kind of help, rather than being a program that kind of pushes our imprint on top of everyone else, we try to be of service to the newsrooms and ultimately to the communities to help them meet their needs.
Excellent. Steve, you talked about saving democracy, and without local news, and people don't necessarily realize it because there still is quite a bit of national news, but as there's less and less local news, it gets replaced by other things. It gets replaced by you're watching and listening and reading more national news. It gets replaced by misinformation. And that has effects on communities. There is lower voter turnout. There is sort of less cohesion in a community. People aren't talking about the same issues together. There are uncontested local races, and there's more polarization. Everybody on this panel is team factual information, including Alan Miller, and he is really working on making sure the next generation is completely aware of these problems and why we need to be factually informed. So Alan, if you would just tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Karen, and good evening, everybody. So I moved from the supply side of journalism to the demand side 13 years ago when I started the News Literacy Project. The information landscape has become infinitely more fraught since then, and the mission all the more urgent. But it's basically, our mission has remained the same, which is to create programs and resources for educators to teach students how to know what news and information to trust, and to give them the tools to be informed, equal, and engaged participants in the civic life of their communities in the country. We also underscore the role of the First Amendment and a free press in a democracy. And we believe that news literacy is an essential skill, a survival skill in an information age, and really critical to pushing back against the scourge of misinformation and conspiratorial thinking that represents an existential threat to democracy. Our primary tool is called the Shakeology Virtual Classroom, and it's a cutting-edge online platform with highly engaging real-world lessons led by a diverse and dynamic group of journalists and experts on the First Amendment and digital media. It's now being used in every state in the country. We had more than 110,000 students complete lessons on it this school year. And we're working directly with school districts, including the largest in New York, LA, Chicago, but also in districts in South Carolina and Alabama and Missouri and Texas. And we know that the platform works because we do a lot of assessment, and students who complete lessons are better able to determine credible information, to understand the standards of quality journalism, to appreciate and know the First Amendment, as well as the watchdog role of a free press. We also determined that the threat is so urgent for this rising toxic tidal wave of misinformation that we needed to do something with the general public. So in the past year, we've created resources for all ages. We have a version of Shakeology for all. We have a version of our weekly newsletter, which takes on the most recent conspiracy theories, hoaxes, and viral rumors and debunks them, called Get Smart About News. We have an app called Informable, which is a game that all ages can play. And we have a podcast called Is That a Fact? And so we now, are reaching all generations, because we feel that democracy, barely survived a stress test on January 6th with the insurrection at the Capitol. And if we don't confront this challenge head on, we may not be so fortunate next time.
Wonderful. Alan, where is Generation Z getting its news and journalism and information?
Well, the truth is that young people are no doubt getting some news, but it's coming through social media. It's coming through, through their feeds, and it's mixed in with everything else. So exponentially more of that information is not intended to inform in a dispassionate, contextual, accurate, accountable way. It's intended to persuade or inflame or mislead. And what we find is that students sometimes literally don't know what news is. I mean, they may be getting it, but they're not aware of what to look for, of what sets it apart. And when they do learn the standards and how to verify information, how to be informed and engaged participants, it's a transformative, it's an incredibly empowering tool for them. Because they're swimming in this tsunami of news and information, but without the ability to successfully navigate it.
Great. Jacquanda, I want to turn back to you a little bit on audiences and how you're working with your audiences. You really came up with a strategy to serve Flint residents. You said yourself, I'm a Flint girl. So you thought that there were stories that weren't being covered. How did you change the lens to make Flint be particularly valuable to residents?
We do a number of things. One, we engage them wherever they are. So I pay close attention to Facebook groups, residents on Facebook, a lot, Twitter, Instagram. If they're highlighting somebody that did something really great in their neighborhood, if they're talking about something that's going on, like I know they had problems with speeding, and so I got that off social media. I participate in community meetings, those meetings that reporters usually don't show up to. I'm there, even if I'm there as a community member. We do things like residents may email us just a question. Like they had questions about a juvenile detention center. We'll investigate it. They may send us things about FOIA. They need some information from our local government and they don't know how to go about doing it. We'll submit the FOIA. But something that we really do is that we pretty much hang out in the community. Everyone who works for me, you can catch us at festivals, neighborhood things. People know who we are. My team, they wear swag a lot, more than I thought they would, right? So we're always somewhere, and we've managed to get quite a few stories to other news outlets. They just didn't have their ear to the ground. And then I'm 45. So I've been here for a while. And so I just know things and I see things. I would get up, especially during COVID, I would take these morning drives and just drive through the city from one end to the other end, from the other end to the other end, and just make notes about different things that I see. Our photographer, KT Kanazowicz, which she's through Report for America, she does the same thing. She just drives around Flint and they ask questions. And so we just have a tendency to just really pay attention to the community, the residents, and that's how we navigate news. For city council can be really dysfunctional in Flint, extremely dysfunctional. And residents kept asking, what happened? Because journalists were covering the dysfunction. Who yelled at who? We stopped doing it. And we just started writing, what happened? This is where your tax dollars went. This is what your council voted on. And residents started telling us thank you because they was confused about city business. And so we just pay attention. I guess I know what it's like not to be heard. And so I always say this thing, like they have a voice, so they're not the voiceless. They just didn't have a platform to be heard. And I consider Flint Beat that platform. And so we work with the community first and move it down the line. So Flint residents first, elected officials, state, that's just how we work news. And it seems to work for us.
So I want to ask you, because you do have a website, and
Yes.
I know before you've done work in print when you said that, physical paper was a way to reach residents.
Mm-hmm.
And now you have an Emmy for video. So how are you doing all that?
I don't know. I've learned how to be the queen of multitasking, for one, because I was alone for a while. So initially we had a template, I built it out. I was the person out there taking pictures. I was the person out there writing the stories. I was the person doing the grant writing, trying to secure ad dollars. Like I was the person running around putting together the mayoral forum, right? And so now things seem a little easy. Like I have a managing editor, full-time reporters. We are interviewing someone to take over for the development director. So I didn't even think about it. Like, how do I make it happen? I was very fortunate being a community person. My videographer is great. His name is Jamal Bransford. And he also believed in the vision. So people on my team, they really believe in what they're doing. I have a young lady, she moved from Florida. I have two that moved from New York, and so they really believe in journalism, local news, and our mission to empower, impact, and inform the audience that we serve. So I live and breathe this. So I don't know. I just wake up in the morning and get it done.
Thanks. Chris, your model is a little bit different, but you are also very concerned about informed communities. So tell me what your operation looks like, and go in a little bit more detail on that.
Sure. So early on, we realized that if we could work with higher education institutions in Virginia around their journalism programs, that would really spread us out around the state, because pretty much we have journalism and programs at universities in every part of the state. It also gives us another avenue for philanthropy, frankly. But it gives us an ability to be in the communities and transparent, as Jacquanda was just saying, and because that's really important. But we are more of a state model, and the kind of work we do takes a little bit longer to do. And so it's been really important that we find good partnerships. So we've partnered and been working very closely with public radio as well as legacy media. We started the Virginia News Service about a year ago to help connect some of those dots. And our members of that are other weeklies and daily newspapers primarily, but in some public radio stations. And so sort of creating this kind of network allows us to penetrate into other communities that we may not have been able to get in before. And we're founded to be very specific about reporting in different communities. In Virginia, I think, and Betsy would probably have a better figure, but I think it's something like 40 papers have been lost, in the last 20 some years. And so there are a lot of communities that really don't even have some amount of reporting going on. And if we can be specific about how we report in those communities, I think we can have in a very transparent way, because I think that's really important. I think communities need to see the journalists working in them and sharing how they did those stories and engaging with those communities about those stories afterwards if we're going to make any real changes.
Betsy, I'd love for you to comment a little bit on what Chris was saying. What are the opportunities for organizations like Chris's to partner with your members?
Oh, I think they're vast. I've been here 5 years at the Press Association, and we lost some papers the first year I was here. We've only lost won in the last 4 years. But what we've really lost is the number of people in the newsroom who can focus on things like Chris is focusing on. So it's not so much the loss of newspapers, it's the shrinking newsroom size. So that there isn't the ability to do, investigative or enterprise journalism. So Chris can partner with an organization like VPA, and we can sort of serve as his wire service, if you will, to connect him with legacy newspapers who might say, oh, I can't send a reporter to Southwest Virginia to talk, to cover what's happening in the coal mining industry. But Chris has written this great, series or this great piece, and we can put that in our newspaper. So there's a lot more collaboration, I think, between newspapers than there was 40 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. They're not really, for the most part, in competition with each other. They're in competition with Facebook. They're in competition with, Twitter. They're in competition with a lot of social media that masks itself as the news, I would say. So Chris has been talking to us since the inception of his idea. And we also, as I've mentioned before, we partner with student journalists at other places like Virginia Commonwealth University, which has the largest journalism school in the state. They have a student news service. They don't do investigative journalism like Chris, but they do cover state government in a really thorough way. And we put that out on the wire, and AP works with them as well. So I think what VPA can do is bring people together. I think VPA can act as a conduit for the SPJ, college journalism programs, Chris's program, Steve Waldman's work, Alan's work, frankly. Alan, I'm on the Virginia Commission for Civics and Education, so you and I need to talk more. But we can be that place, that resource where anybody can go to say, we want to improve local journalism. We want to support the First Amendment and the free press. VPA will hook you up with anybody. So I think that's one of our roles, and it's one that I think is important.
So Betsy, I'd like to ask you, for the folks listening in the audience who don't understand, why are there fewer local reporters today? Why? It seems like there's more news, there's more Facebook, there are more links.
Right.
Why?
Well, it's a sort of a perfect storm of things that have happened over the last 30 years or so. Jacquanda was saying she's 45. She's so young. I'm 65. And so I think, a lot has happened since I left journalism school 40 some years ago. And it's been a combination of loss of ad revenue because of social media. It's been a corporatization of the news media. And Steve and Alan know a lot about this, where we had individual owners of newspapers. At one point, we have very few of those left in Virginia or any state. Gannett, Tribune, these companies own newspapers, and they are very, and not to put them down, but they're very profit oriented. And so as a result, the first thing that's cut is the newsroom. And it's when you're in a lot of fields, there's things where if you're not a money producer, if you're not a revenue producer, when you're in a company and it needs to make cuts, they cut the people who aren't producing revenue. And unfortunately, they think of reporters that way. And so newsrooms have shrunk as a result of all these various forces. And so where there might have been 3 or 4 people covering the news in a small daily, a small weekly. My son works at a weekly in Virginia, and there's him and the editor, and that's it. And while it's a rural community, that's not really enough to cover the news the way they would like to cover it. So this is not unique to Virginia. As you know, Karen, it's everywhere, but it's started more at the daily level. And as more and more weeklies got bought up by these chains, it's gone down to the weekly level. So people are trying to do it all with fewer resources. And there's also something that's happened, which I think is very startling. And Steve probably covered this in 2011 when he looked at the news industry. But we also don't have any local people. And I'm not just talking about reporters. We don't have any publishers anymore. I'd be hard pressed to find a publisher to put on my board because they don't exist. So at papers that are owned by chains, they've taken the publisher role away. So there's no face to the paper. The paper has sold its building, so there's no physical entity in the town anymore. There aren't people like Jacquanda is covering it. She's, like she said, she's in the community. Well, you've only got 2 reporters at some of these weeklies. They're not in the community. So it's as though newspapers have disappeared. I would contend that newspapers are still the best thing going on in small towns because they're still the only newsroom in that town. But it's a tough time for newspapers because of the fact that they don't have a face, they don't have a presence, and they don't have the newsroom that they really need and deserve.
Alan, did you want to jump in here on a point?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. So Betsy, I'm happy to take you up on your invitation about the civics and the Education Commission. We believe that the ability to know what news and information to trust, and also to distinguish, to discern the kind of quality journalism that others on the panel are producing, is absolutely essential for education, for the future of journalism, and for democracy. And the way to achieve this is to see this embedded in state teaching standards around the country as a requirement that students learn this and are tested for it before they graduate. And we're not alone in this. There are others who are trying to bring back civics and media literacy. We think news literacy is a key component of any of those. And so that's one of the missions we've staked out for ourselves in the future, to play a leading role in seeing news literacy to become a requirement for graduation from high school. And that's the lasting systemic change that can really, take a big step to fixing this problem and preserving quality journalism, I might add.
Thank you, Alan. There was a comment from an attendee about news organizations advocating for a news literacy requirement for high school graduation. It doesn't only have to be news organizations, certainly. We welcome informed and engaged citizens to advocate for that as well. Courtney, I want to give you a chance to talk about, there are 300 members at the Institute for Not-for-Profit News, and they would not call themselves newspapers, but they would but they do serve, many of them serve local communities. What's happening in that new emerging space?
Yes, I feel like Betsy really set it up well, talking about how the commercial model for journalism, particularly at the local level, is very challenged. And amidst that, you see newsrooms looking to a nonprofit model to really be a foundation for a sustainable operation. And part of this shift, is, quite frankly, the business model, right? They're 501c3, they can accept tax deductible donations, but it goes so much more, it's so much more further than that. And I think Jacquanda and Chris on the panel pretty much are great examples of what it looks like to be an organization, a newsroom that is grounded in the community and has an orientation towards public service, that it is in the core of its mission, and that it sees its pathway to sustainability by getting support from communities. And that's really what the nonprofit model is. I think it is encouraging to see nonprofit organizations work with commercial media and doing collaborations. We see that happening more and more. We see, but the collaborative spirit is so natural to how nonprofit news organizations operate. Dedication to equity, dedication, being accountable to their readers are really sort of what grounds a lot of the work of INN members. Another INN member that isn't on the panel today, but that is based in Virginia, is Charlottesville Tomorrow. They began in 2005, but in 2019, literally stopped and said, we need to revisit what we're doing and why we're doing it. And they reshaped their mission statement to focus on promoting civic education and addressing equity in their community. This is the type of doubling down that nonprofit news organizations are doing. It may not be what gets the most clicks and is the most profitable for ad revenue, but it is critical and critically important to the quality of life of the people that they serve. Another great example we see in nonprofit media are people who are really experimenting with new ways of actually telling the news and distributing it. You know, first comes to mind is Outlier Media, that has sort of been a leader in this effort and addressing, distributing the news via text message. And that is their primary mode of news distribution. During the pandemic outbreak, people were sending them hundreds of text messages about where to find food, about is this a fact or not? And they directly investigate, similar to how Jacquanda was saying, when people send them an email, they directly investigate topics that are of interest to individuals in their community. And through it all, they're seeing trends emerge. They're seeing broader issues and systematic issues emerge, and then they report that in partnership with larger news entities. So in the nonprofit news sector, we're seeing a very grassroots, ambitious, grounded set of leaders that are really, in many ways, they're not necessarily looking to replace what used to be. They're building something completely different and new that really serves people. And I think that as exciting as this is, the reality is, like, challenges still remain about how to sustain the work. There's still a lot of education to do around that philanthropic case for support. And when we get to Q&A, that's kind of one of the questions I have for Jacquanda and Chris, are like, you're doing great work, but challenges still remain on operating your organization sustainably.
Chris, do you want to take a stab at answering what Courtney just put out there? Chris, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I mean, I've been, pretty much at every turn, taking any course I can take through INN and other organizations that offer development skills and training. I'm a journalist. Even though I did work for a number of years after I left the Virginia pilot and worked directly with nonprofits and helped them in communicating their missions and their stories. I don't have that background in development that others have. And we started our organization with a lot of spit and hard work to get this going, a couple of journalists. And so, through organizations like INN, through the Knight Foundation, through, variety of foundations, we've been able to get that support. But I think what I love about our organization is that we are a nonprofit. We are the public's company. And I'm thrilled that the majority of our funding comes from the average citizen in Virginia, not from a corporation and not from some other group, but primarily through citizens who believe in the work that we're doing. And we have a very long way to go, and we would like to have all 8 million citizens of Virginia contributing, because that would give us a nice long runway for the work we want to do. It's $1, so come on, Virginia. But but we're making inroads, and every year has been a gain over the last year. And I credit a lot of that, to organizations like INN and Lion and Report for America, who are really helping organizations like ours get off the ground.
So Chris, you said you're not a development person, but you made an ask, so great, good for you. And, Report for America, they're placing reporters in newsrooms across the country, but they're also really working with newsrooms to make sure they know how to fundraise and know how to get the match dollars. That's actually been really successful for you, Steve.
It has been, and it kind of become like almost a co-equal part of the program, because we realize that it's so important for the newsrooms to be economically sustainable, in addition to using the reporters. And so we have a sort of SWAT team of sustainability coaches, or sort of circuit riders, that go around and work with the local newsrooms to help them develop this skill. And it looks very different in each community. Sometimes it's going to a community foundation and getting, a big grant. Sometimes it's identifying high net worth individuals. Sometimes it's doing, membership programs, small donor campaigns. Those are really fun to watch, because very often it'll be literally the people who send in their checks will write the name of the Report for America reporter, like, go Zach, he's doing great. And, it's a really interesting kind of marketing lesson too, frankly, is that, like, you you have to show people in very vivid terms what it is, what the journalism is that you're doing. You can't make it all just abstract about democracy and information. You have to show, why, if you want to know whether your schools are improving, you need Zach Podmore in your life and why you should support them. And so we've had, I think that last year, our newsrooms raised $5 million for themselves with our help. That's not to us, but to them. And that's growing very rapidly. And I think the reason it's growing rapidly, well, one is that to some degree, what was holding them back was fear. They'd never done it before, but once they got the hang of it, they realized it wasn't that hard. And they actually started way out raising. They started with just raising $10,000 to fund a portion of the Report for America person, but very often they would then blow right past that and start raising money for other things in the newsroom. The other thing is that the community is starting to understand more how incredibly serious the collapse of local news is for their community, that it's not just a problem or primarily a problem for journalists. It's not mostly a problem for journalists. Like, most of the journalists can get jobs doing something else. It's a problem for the functioning of the community and their own ability to solve their own problems. And that, frankly, has been really slow to happen, as you know, Karen, because Knight Foundation for the longest time was the lone voice in the wilderness on this, trying to get community foundations to look at it that way. And we're starting to see it change, but it's at the very beginning of the process. And it's really, one of the most important things that has to happen for all of these groups to succeed is for the communities themselves to awaken to their own role in all this, of supporting it. It's not going to be the car dealership that floats the boat anymore. It has to be local donors and local foundations, as well as subscribers, that make community journalism happen.
Absolutely. There were definitely small businesses that were supporting local news. They, and in some ways, sometimes they were just supporting where people were getting information. It wasn't always directly the investigative journalism or directly the education coverage. People read the paper for a number of different reasons: to get the sports scores, to get the movie times. And then they found the very important journalism that was done. And that doesn't exist anymore. And so philanthropy has stepped up, but there are other folks stepping up as well. We've mentioned already Google and Facebook doing some funding as well. I do want to invite the audience for questions. I have one that I do want to pose. I think it's for Alan. We mentioned January, it's Catherine Timko. We mentioned January 6th. What do you think is the best means to counter false news and alternative facts? Those of us who read the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post probably get accurate info, but what about those Facebook news, those Facebook groups, the newsletters that spread info? What do we do about that? Alan.
So there's no panacea here. I do want to pick up on, there's certainly a role for government. There's a role, certainly the social media companies have belatedly begun to become somewhat more responsible in terms of removing toxic content and those who are creating it that undermines democracy and public health and foments hate and violence from their sites. But I want to pick up on a theme that Steve just touched upon, and I think it goes to both preserving, again, quality journalism at the local level, but also to pushing back against the scourge of misinformation, which is that we really need a new sense of personal responsibility. I think we need a change in the ethos of how people consume and share news and information, much like we've seen around issues like drunk driving and littering and recycling, in our lifetimes, that where people say that they're going to be part of an information solution instead of the misinformation problem, and that false content stops with me, or friends don't let friends share false content, and basically learn some of the elemental skills, kind of the habits of mind, to discern credible information, ferret out false information, and then push back against it. Ask for corrections, tell people who are spreading things to stop doing so, because so much of this is inadvertent. I think people don't recognize that this toxic content couldn't get the kind of virality it gets without so many of us infecting others with it. And so I think that that's really a critical thing that, what we like to do is turn kind of our mission into a movement. And where there's a real national ethos looking for, again, quality information, quality news, but at the same time being an upstander for fact against conspiratorial thinking and hoaxes and viral rumors.
Thank you. We have another question. This one I'm going to give to Courtney. This is about, please address the issue of the community funding local news outlets and which ones publish mostly local news and which one, and this talks about which one are filling pages with 10% local news and 90% non-local news.
Yeah, I think I saw that question. I think this question really points to, some of the things that Betsy cited earlier, that we are not clear yet on having a sustainable model for local news. And even though you do see news organizations that are beginning to appeal to their readers or appeal to individuals increasingly more and more and having success, there still are lots of questions around how do we actually build out the pipeline of revenue that we're going to need to fully staff our organization to cover local as it should be. And I think that what you see is, there's still a lot of work to be done for a local news outlet to be reporting local coverage or regional coverage at the rate in which it once was. And likely in that situation where maybe only a fraction of their content is local, even though they are garnering community support, it's likely because of that's what they can fund to produce. I mean, I don't know exactly what newspaper the question is referring to, but I think it just signals that, there's a lot of work to be done. And we're just the field of journalism outside of public media, honestly, is new to the world of philanthropy, is really just turning to communities for support. And we're still in this transition period. And I say that to also say, it's still very fragile. Like on this panel, there's some very exciting and encouraging and inspiring things that we're hearing, but this is not the norm. It's still a very fragile situation that we're in. And we really need to make, a transformation in how communities are supporting journalism.
If I could just add to what Courtney said, there's 1,800 communities in America now that have no newspaper, 1,800. But that's a vast understatement of the problem because of the type of situation that this questioner is asking. The term in our industry now for this is a ghost newspaper. That's a newspaper that it's still coming out. There's still paper, there's still stuff in it. There's still a lot of national news, but there's very little, if any, local news. So it basically is another couple thousand new communities that aren't being covered at all. So that is, and the collapse is accelerating. Since 2000, there's been a 66% drop in the number of reporters. So that's a collapse on the scale of the coal industry's collapse. And it's accelerating because of some of the hedge funds. Now we are now at this moment in history when half of the daily news circulation in America is owned by hedge funds. So this is getting worse. We had a little bit of a temporary propping up, but from PPP, frankly, from the COVID relief, and now the collapse will continue apace. So, and honestly, even though I'm very, very grateful to the philanthropic organizations that supported Report for America and the others on here, the philanthropic world hasn't done nearly enough, in my view. This is actually a solvable problem. The crisis is incredibly consequential, but it's not actually that expensive in the scale of big philanthropy. And it's really pretty small how much philanthropy has done. Now, it's early in some sense, it's a new issue for them, as Courtney said, but wow, we really need the philanthropic world to step up in a dramatic way if we're going to have any hope of turning the corner.
Karen, can I jump in there?
Absolutely, Betsy.
I run a press association that, of course, has 2 or 3 nonprofit members, and the rest are for-profit. And I come out of a background of development and fundraising for several different nonprofits, all of whom were statewide. And I relish the role of the nonprofit world in supporting journalism. It's my passion. However, I don't see it as the answer overall. I see it as part of the equation. There are 7,000 newspapers in America, and I don't believe we're going to have 7,000 NPR outlets tomorrow being funded, newspapers being funded like NPR outlets. I think nonprofits and fundraising plays an enormous role, but I'm old enough to remember when I watched television for free, and I'm embarrassed to tell you what my husband and I pay per month to watch cable shows, Netflix, whatever it is, and still watch commercials. So I believe the communities have a role to play here, but it's not always going to be through fundraising or nonprofits. I believe that they need to pay for the newspapers or the media outlets that they're watching, reading, listening to. And so I think it's going to be a combination of things, Steve. I think that we're going to need people to say, God, I don't want to lose my local newspaper. I'm going to pay to subscribe to it at a rate that makes sense. So I'm hoping it's all of those things kind of come together, and it's not just one, because I agree with you. There's plenty of money out there, but there's plenty of competition for that money as well. So
True. No,
I would chime in and say, the role of our organization is meant not to put out those local papers out of business. Our is to support that legacy media, because in so many instances they've been in these communities for 100 years in Virginia or more, and so but they need support. The question is, does that support go to the hedge fund, or does it go to the news organization? And potentially, local news organizations will wrangle away from that. I don't know if that'll actually happen. But I do know that if we can offer support and help those organizations get back in their communities, that show that, if we can partner with these newspapers and produce really strong watchdog journalism that can change lives, and we get people in the community talking about it and showing how we did that and building that transparency, I think we can repair, at least, start to repair what's been done and grow some local journalism roots again and rebuild that trust. That's sort of our approach here at VCIJ as we move forward.
Yeah. Can I chime in also?
Absolutely.
Steve, I like how you said ghost newspapers, because I always say we have a content desert. We have 3 TV news outlets. We have a legacy from here, some smaller newsrooms, but the content was the same. Some newsrooms faced the challenge, like you said, competing with social media, ad dollars. And so it became like a click game, analytics, right? And so, we just have a tendency not to focus on that. We focus on the impact of the news in the community, and we can because of the model. Like, we really have this nonprofit model. Like, this is a public service, right? And so it becomes a balancing game. Like, how much do you rely on donations? How much do you rely on membership? But you have to have that diverse revenue model in order to sustain yourself, because tomorrow foundations may not be investing in journalism. It's just the truth. It's just the real hard truth that we have to deal with. And also, for me, being a person of color leading a newsroom, the struggle is real. And I always I tell people about George Floyd, because he died and he opened up so many doors. People just started investing in people of color, and so we were able to get more money last year than we ever have because of George Floyd dying and because of COVID. So, but that's over. Where we eventually will come out of COVID. What does that look like for my newsroom? Like, where are we getting funding? So it's a struggle. And Betsy, you're right. We really have to balance this. And so we're working really hard right now while we're in it to build a plan for sustainability, to put it in motion, to get people to become members, to get people to pay for news in a community that's very poor.
Right.
Jacquanda, there are a couple of questions in the chat, and I think
Okay.
they're kind of for you because you said I started my own thing, and I think people are just asking career questions about how do you start your own thing, and can you do it if you're just not 22, right out of college? And I think if you could just sort of talk about that a little bit for the audience.
I would never tell anyone to do it like I did. Like, I literally stepped out on journalistic faith and launched this thing like I was already had money in the bank. I don't think I had an option because I was working for what would be considered now my competition. I remember being in the newsroom, writing a story for Flint Beat on a weekend with a Flint Beat byline. I was still working for Advanced Local. They just happened to send me this stuff on my personal email, personal phone. I wrote it, no byline, no money. And then that Monday when I went into the newsroom, my editor said, "Hey, I saw this thing on something called Flint Beat. Can you follow up on it?" So I had no choice but to quit. But I would say this, if you can maybe start a newsletter, collect email addresses, aggregate, just see what your audience wants, start that way. But I started with nothing, like nothing. And it was very stressful. It's been a long journey. Even when I first met Karen, I think I was still talking like a journalist, talking about stories. My mind hadn't shifted, right? And if I didn't have people like Karen and Tracy Powell, I would probably still be talking I'd probably be standing on the corner shaking a can right now. So think about the things you need outside of editorial. As journalists, we have a tendency to jump in this thing and think about the news first instead of the business operation. Like, would I had invested in somebody to handle membership? Would I had invested in someone to be the director of development and help do grant writing? It took me a minute before I got there. What support is out there for the type of journalism that you're doing? Like, think about it like you would a story. Investigate it. Do your due diligence before you jump out there. So that's the best advice I can give.
Kendall Swank, I hope that helped you with your questions. Starting a newsletter, there are definitely folks who are doing that, on Substack as well. So that's another opportunity. Just kind of.
Can I add a note? Can I add?
Yes, absolutely.
I think if I could highlight what Jacquanda just said, she said, ask your community what it is they want. And I think that, we talked earlier about, this news ecosystem. You have commercial, you have nonprofit, and really you need, for a healthy community, you need multiple sources of information that are doing different types of things, right? It can't just be one source of news. You need a diversity of sources of news. So you need that ecosystem. But I feel like where those that lead ahead in that community are ones that are doing just that, are ones that have their ear to the ground more than their mouths open. And in the sense that they are listening and they're looking out for what issues that people are having in their community. They're adapting their news product, the way that the news looks, to be more accessible to people in their community. Newsletters have been a really effective way at just reaching more people, and not just it being more efficient for the startup organization itself. Same with SMS text message. So I feel like, what Jacquanda said is really leading with asking and listening before doing.
Thank you, Courtney. We have about 20 minutes left. I know some more questions are going to come in. There's one from Clark Hoyt. Steve, you also are playing a role investigating the role of government to support local news and healthy local media ecosystems. I want to give you a chance to talk about that, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of a lightning round on solutions and bright spots.
Yeah, I do think government and public policy is part of the solution, part of the discussion, in addition to commercial innovation and philanthropic growth. It's tricky, obviously. Like, the thought of the government funding the news business is pretty terrifying, and it's not hard to see how horribly wrong that could go. But we can't be paralyzed by that. There have been cases in the past where there's been smart government policy that has helped local news, going back to the founding fathers and the very, very substantial subsidy they gave through the postal subsidy to the creation of the newspaper industry. And so we created a group called the Rebuild Local News Coalition about a year ago, pulling together all these different associations and groups that are trying to work in this field for local news, from the weekly newspapers, Black newspapers, nonprofits, INN, as well as the sort of innovation funders like American Journalism Project. And it's a kind of almost comically broad coalition, like really conservative weekly newspaper publishers from Oklahoma and nonprofit progressive advocacy groups that think, capitalism is incompatible with journalism, and everything in between. So it's been a little bit of a trick of trying to find the common area, but we have, and it's basically called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. It was reintroduced last week, and it's really good. And the reason it's a very interesting and different approach than the focus. It's not creating a big government agency or doing like a public broadcasting system. There are certainly advocates for that too, but this is a little bit different. The idea is you'd have a tax credit to all Americans that they can use to buy a subscription to a newspaper or donate to a nonprofit. So it actually just amplifies. You still have to get people to care. You still have to get people to want to subscribe. So there's a real market element to it, but it amplifies the buying power of people who want to do it. The second thing is a payroll tax credit for news organizations to directly underwrite the most, costly part of the thing, which is the labor, the reporters. And then the third is a tax credit to small businesses that they can use to advertise in local newspapers. So I think it's a very cool idea. It's a very clever approach because it would actually pump a lot of money into the local news system, but not with a top-down way. It is sort of platform neutral. It's future friendly. New things that come up can benefit from this just as much as the legacy players. So get your congressperson to co-sponsor this thing. It's called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. There are other approaches out there. I just got specific with it because it's a little hard for people. People immediately go to the horror scenarios, which are real, of like, how on earth can the government help the media? Like it's the muckrakers getting money from the muck makers. It doesn't really make sense when you think about it that way, but there actually are ways to do it. And I think if we're viewing local news as a public good to some degree, that some elements of what we do are, then we need to look at things like this as well.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, I want to make sure everybody gets a second. So these are going to be quick answers. So Chris,
Yes.
I would like to ask you two questions. First, what would you ask of this audience, if anything, on this topic?
Around the topic of nonprofit or the future
of journalism, of journalism and the journalism that you do.
Well,
answer that quickly, and then I'll give you my next one.
Yeah, well, I'm literally in the shadow of Monticello, and I know if Thomas Jefferson were sitting on this panel tonight, he'd be a little bit horrified, I think, in sort of the state of where things are at, and advocating, I believe, for new ways of doing journalism, because it is integral. It's without it, you don't have a representative democracy, and he knew that. And so, I think if I'm asking the public a question, it's like, what would you like from organizations like ours? How would you like us to serve you? Where are you at? Where can we give you the information you need to be engaged? And how available would you be to being a participant in our journalism? Because it's not really just enough that you get it. If you're not using it, you're not using that information to build a stronger democracy. So I think that's sort of what I'm I would say to that.
Okay, that's excellent. That's Alan Miller. What would you ask sort of this audience? I want to ask everybody the question. The issues that you discussed tonight, the work that you've done and you're doing to educate the public. There were a lot of questions I could tell from teachers, from academics. What would you ask of this audience listening to you?
Well, first of all, I want to echo the comments of others, is to support local journalism, number one. That's critical. And I think on the flip side, that people learn more about how to be discerning about the news and information that they are consuming and sharing, to learn some basic skills in terms of searching and reverse image searching, and we have a new resource called Googling Like a Pro on our site at newslit.org. And then, not only to apply those, but to share them with others, to push back against misinformation when people see it, and even in terms of journalism, to engage, to play a role, whether it's suggesting stories or reaching out to news organizations when they missed a story, or when you feel you see bias or inaccuracy in reporting, or that there's a certain community not being covered, to really engage with the journalism itself, but particularly also to become an upstanders for facts in terms of your own consumption habits, sharing habits, and then what you see with others to push back those who are spreading toxic misinformation.
Okay, great. Betsy, I'd like to ask the same question.
Okay. I guess what I'd ask from the public is to learn to understand and appreciate news and then support it. I guess I'm not convinced that people care any less about what's going on in their community than they ever have. But the way to find out what's going on in your community, what's important, what steps you need to take to change your community, how to engage, the only way to learn that is through a real local news entity, a real media outlet. And in our case, I think that's newspapers. So support it by buying the newspaper, support it by advertising in the newspaper, support it by making a contribution to your newspaper. Keep us all engaged in our communities by supporting local journalism.
Okay. Courtney.
I'd say in addition to finding a newsroom to support is remain alert. We cannot be comfortable. As I said earlier, there's still a lot of risk in having a continuance of the decline in local news. And so I think that if you could share this conversation with your colleagues, with your family, with people that you're around, bring into conversation that we are facing a challenge and crisis in local news, because really building that awareness is one of the steps to then asking for support and receiving a donation. So spread the message.
If I may, I just wanted to follow up on one thing Betsy said, and I think it's important. There is really no one solution to this problem. It's newspapers, it's nonprofit news organizations, it's public radio. It is how we all work together in solving this equation that's going to make a difference. And if we continue to be siloed and not working together in moving forward, we're going to lose the rest of the public. And that's when it really gets critical, in my opinion.
Okay. Steve, I'd also like to ask you kind of what's giving you hope. I mean, you're working on a number of different things, so.
A lot, actually, because with Report for America, first of all, I get tremendous hope from the core members, these reporters that apply to us. We had 1,800 applicants for 130 open slots. And we could have placed many, many more than we did. And what's exciting about them is not just their talent, but that they want to go to small communities or want to go to local communities to do this kind of really community-based reporting. they actually have come to believe that's really important and a little bit sexy, which I never thought I would see. So there's a really, that's a very encouraging thing. You're starting to see the philanthropic world wake up to the importance of this. Still early, but it's starting to happen. You're definitely seeing the commercial world focus more on subscriptions and finally, you know, recognizing that the days that a 70% of money coming from advertising are over and that they're only going to survive by serving their readers well and having subscriptions. And we're seeing some really interesting conversations about government policy that I know there's probably more serious conversation about smart government policy right now than we've had probably in a couple of decades. And, you know, not that anything's going to necessarily happen just because that's always a long shot, but it's definitely better than it was a year ago. And it's really pretty encouraging.
Jacquanda, I'd like to just ask you a little bit about, you know, you said you started this not that long ago, and where do you see, like, where do you feel, obviously you're able to fundraise more and you're getting accolades, but tell me a little bit about how it's changed the community. How has it changed Flint, your work?
I feel like this community, people in the city, they see themselves, their neighborhoods, their problems, their strides in our news organization. When they get up and whenever they tap into Flint Beat, they can see those stories that matter to them, the things that they care about, and the people that they care about. I see it. I'm a reader, right? And so my staff have covered family members without even knowing they were my family. I don't intervene in the editorial side in that way. And I literally woke up one day and my cousin's picture was right there. And it made me feel good. So they see that. They see us caring because we're out in the community. We knock on doors, that old school journalism thing. We actually do that. You know? So I think that in itself has had a huge impact in Flint and the coverage that we're able to provide. They give us stories, they invite us to their tables, you know. But I do have to say, when you ask, like, what can people do? What would I ask them to do? Number one, if you're a journalist, don't count us out. You know, there's a lot of times when independent newsrooms, sometimes we struggle finding talent because we're not the big guys, you know, but we're as competitive a lot of times with pay. The work that we do is phenomenal. We're award-winning newsrooms, not just Flint Beat. There's so many of us that's really out there working hard. If you are running a newsroom and you don't have capacity, don't leave partnership out. You know, I think Betsy talked about this earlier. Like, we've partnered with the Center for Public Integrity. We partner with the trace.org. We partner with Frontline PBS, partnered with New York Times. You know, don't leave partnership out. There's probably somebody out there to help you carry this forward. And give. When it comes around those holidays, every dollar matters. I'm a Newsmatch girl. Because of Newsmatch, we can pay a salary for our Report for America reporter. Just give $5, $10, $20, $30. I don't care. It all adds up to something, especially for newsrooms as small as mine. So just, you know, keep us in mind when those things come around. If you are a funder, we need you. You know, we're here, we need you. A lot of times we need you for at least 3 years minimum. We need you to commit to our newsrooms and the work that we're doing. We're finding that works. This is our second year with Borealis. And I don't know where we would be without that second year support. And then they're also hoping to get a third year, right? So support us, partner, work for us, and give.
Okay, that was a good list. Okay, so I just, you know, I thank you so much to everyone. Betsy Edwards, Virginia Press Association, Courtney Hurt, Newsmatch, Institute for Not-for-profit news, Jacquanda Johnson, Flint Beat, Alan C. Miller, News Literacy Project, Chris Tyree, Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism, Steve Waldman, Report for America. Thank you to everyone in the audience. If you're interested in sharing this conversation with others, Virginia Humanities is definitely going to post it on their page tomorrow and send that out by email to everybody who registered. And, I just wanted to say again that, the big themes here that are new for journalism, collaboration and partnerships. We talked about people looking at newsletters and listening to podcasts as well. Journalism really turning to individual donors, residents donating dollars and saying what they need. Chris talked about saying what is of value to it. We will cover what you need. Jacquanda talked about that as well. And Steve, of course, talked about government solutions, and philanthropy does play a role, but it's also local philanthropy, community foundations, family foundations. And of course, all the different, there are many other government solutions that are being discussed now as well. Steve touched on a few of them. So thank you to everyone who watched. Remember, when you're reading something or and you're mentioning to others, I read somewhere, say, I read it in Flint Beat. I read it in Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism. Give somebody a source. It's not just the New York Times. It's not just the LA Times. It's not just the Washington Post. Those are great organizations, but please also, source and mention your local news organizations as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.